it is better for us to go to our own schools, and after we have a thorough knowledge of ourselves, of our own kind, and racial dignity has been instilled within us, then we can go to anyone's school and we'll still retain our race pride, our racial dignity, and we will be able to avoid the subservient inferiority complex that most Negroes have, or that is instilled within most Negroes who receive this sort of integrated education.
One great African-centered success story is J.S. Chick Elementary School, where test scores exceeded state averages, where African-American students view themselves as leaders. This school is located in Kansas City, Missouri, which was a grassroots effort among African-American educators and parents that happened around 1991. A representative there said, its success is measured not only by test scores that are above the statewide average, but also by students learning to see themselves as leaders, entrepreneurs, and contributors to the community. There are 5 major benefits to an African-centered education. Number 1, it develops African culture consciousness. One effect of the enslavement of African people has been a distortion of their cultural consciousness. Preeminent educator and author Dr. Amos Wilson argues that when a people's culture is distorted, their capacity to appropriately organize, evaluate, and classify information to deal with reality is impaired. He further argued that culture must be used as a conduit of solving problems and meeting the needs of the people. African-centered scholars and educators argue that children of African descent must be taught their culture through a process of re-Africanization. This process begins with an African-centered education that entails studying, observing, and eventually fully practicing their culture that defines, creates, celebrates, and sustains and develops them. Number 2, creates an African self-identity. During the transatlantic slave trade that took place between the Americas, Europe, and Caribbean, millions of African people were sold into slavery. Over the course of 400 years, African people's identity has been distorted as they were stripped of their original languages, their original African names, and spirituality. In addition, African people on the continent experienced a different kind of identity crisis through colonization, which divided Africa into colonies and imposed foreign languages and cultural values. African-centered scholars and educators attempt to provide a framework for the reconstruction of African cultures and identities around the best morals, values, and cultural practices that both traditional and contemporary African societies have to offer. Number 3, produces African institution builders. An institution is defined as any structure or mechanism of social order governing the behavior of a set of individuals within a given community and are identified as a social purpose, ascending individuals and intentions by mediating the rules that govern living behavior. In the State of African Education, renowned educator and author Dr. Asa Hilliard writes, a global system of power distribution has dictated and continues to dictate the nature of the education and socialization processes. African-centered educators maintain that there can be no true African-centered education until people of African descent control the institutions within their community. Institution building provides necessary agents that are designed to impart knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes necessary to survive and progress. Number 4, produces Black nation builders. Along with culture and identity, education must help restore the concept of nationhood, manhood, and womanhood for African people, according to the historian and educator Dr. John Henry Clark. African-centered educators believe that wherever blacks happen to be in the world, they constitute a nation or a nation that is within a nation. We have to get to the point of agency. agency eventually leads towards nation building. Agency and nation building involve the intentional and focused attempt to develop African youth to the specifically trained to further develop and administrate the state, that is, control of the community. And 5, empowers black students. Professor and author Dr. Wade Nobles states in his book that an African-centered curriculum appropriately connects the black experience to the African cultural worldview and value systems. This connection facilitates a healthy context from which African Americans can learn about and understand themselves and the world. In 2012 study published in the journal Child Development found racial pride to be the most powerful factor in protecting children from the sting of discriminatory behavior. It directly and positively related to 3 out of 4 academic outcomes: grade point averages, educational aspirations, and cognitive engagement, and was also related to resilience in the face of discrimination. As African people, we think we are completely free, rewarding ignorance over education, celebrating destructive behavior. There was a need to give a full-length review of the colonialism of the Africans faced on the continent and the enslavement in the Americas, because Europeans enforced the same tactics to keep African people in a state of ignorance so they could remain docile servants with no hope of a future to be free and self-reliant. Europeans also had the same reactionary measures when Africans became more intelligent and resisted their oppression. It is also important to know that traditional African indigenous values on the historic importance of education, learning, and reading is very important for us to take home. It was clear and documented throughout world history that Africans shared their vast intellect with non-African peoples of the world. This shows that rewarding ignorance of the historic value of African intelligence and education is one of the most ridiculous things many Africans need to quit priding themselves on. Once we have immersed ourselves in this indigenous African knowledge, we will not only have more pride about ourselves, we will make the necessary steps to pursue a serious ideology or program that will completely liberate African people around the world.